perspectives with some sharing space. Odrisutu, who's one of the worldwide scientists in the field of Physarum, which is a species, and we'll talk about their capacities. It's a unicellular organism. And then we will also have Sergi Valverde, who started his technological evolution lab. He'll talk about collective intelligence in relationship with humans and how humans solve problems. And you will see that there are some common points between both talks. I'm going to present briefly to try and add a few more things. I'll try to talk about some interesting things related to the origin of cognition, and collective intelligence is a key component, and I think that it's worth to talk about some specific concepts so that we can clarify what collectivity means, what collective intelligence means. Termites are one of the best examples. Here we see them in Africa. We see Richard and Barrow, in case someone doesn't know that. And you see that they are megastructures created by small organisms, and each small organism doesn't know what it does. We don't understand how they build these structures, and it's the collective intelligence of the termites that allows them to build these big structures. So this is a first idea. And we'll talk about collective intelligence, so we need to think about the intelligence coming from the brains that we understand better, and how the different pieces interact in the brain. There is also this emergence, because if we want to understand the origin of memory, for instance, we will never understand it by just looking at individual neurons, because individual neurons do not have collective memory. Now we know that memory and other complex phenomena in the brain happen in a network of interconnected neurons. So we can't reduce the intelligence just to the cognition of the different elements. That doesn't mean that this is not important. It is, of course, but we need to include another thing, which is the interactions, and this is what we're going to talk about today as well. So we need to ask ourselves the following. If we want to know what the origin of intelligence is, of course it's difficult to define intelligence, but where can we look at in nature? Well, we can look at different places in nature, and we are trying to develop a general theory. The cognition, the different networks that think are found in different places in nature. And that's why a while ago we proposed an idea in a workshop at the Institute of Santa Fe in New Mexico, place that seems to attract a lot of meteorites. So we thought about talking about the science of liquid versus solid brains, because the collective intelligence in nature happens in our brain, in the neuronal networks that share information between changing connections. But if we look at, for instance, these ants, the system is fluid, because there aren't fixed elements that are at the same place all the time. So how does collective intelligence emerge here, and how, or what we can learn? Can we learn things from them? And well, this is related to many questions that we'll talk about. Maybe you will want to ask a few questions yourself, and we're going to see what we know about intelligence, whether we can create it in the lab, whether we can have artificial intelligence, well, and other questions related to other aspects. Since none of the two speakers are going to talk about plants, I thought that it would be interesting for me to talk about plants. Can we talk about intelligence with regards to plants? Here we have an image from Minority Report, which is a sci-fi film based on a novel by Philip K. Dick, and at a specific point there is this scientist that has these plants that can give different responses or reactions. How or why we don't see these plants in the nature? We wonder a lot about why we don't see these structures in nature. And then another thing that I'd like to mention, because there's been a lot of talk about it, and it's about the fact that we know a lot of things and we do not know a lot of other things. And sometimes there's this idea circulating that plants are intelligence. And if we want to talk about this, we need a functional definition. And we've seen that the ground, the floor in forests have communication networks that are very interesting, but sometimes quick conclusions have been drawn. But of course, this is another field of cognition, maybe collective cognition, that is worth studying. And so we've learned that in nature, the better we understand how the different entities communicate between themselves, it can be bacteria in our intestines, related to the microbiome, and it's been seen that the bacteria in this ecosystem talks to our immune system and it talks to our brain. So maybe they are not intelligent by their own, but it's clear that it's part of our cognition. And then Audrey will talk about other systems, Fisharum, and that's everything I'll say. She will give you more details. And the immune system, we have cells that move through our blood, and the cells are in a network. They can learn, they have memory. So the question is, up to what extent liquid collective or network, how complex can it be? And then finally, we're going to talk about humans, because of course sometimes we talk too much about collective intelligence without thinking what it really means, because having a lot of people in a specific place thinking together does not mean that there is some collective intelligence. So I thought about sharing this image with you. I'm not a big fan, I don't really like people in pajamas all day long, but in Star Trek there's this idea about Borgs, a sort of civilization where each individual has a brain, but they are a colony, so they function as colonies of ants. Would this be possible in nature? Could we have a network with big, or that connects individuals with big brains? We suspect it is not possible, but what would be the implication for us as a society? Could we use or exploit some of the properties of collective intelligence, or could we not exploit them? And it's interesting to think that in the last 15 years there's been a lot of work from the field of complex systems physics to understand whether human beings could develop a theory that would allow us to talk about collective behaviors. A field where this has worked quite well is when human beings stop behaving as human beings. For instance, when we panic, or when we are under different situations. These are simulations, computer simulations, and each person here, well, we have the simulation of the organism, and the movements are based on equations. So let's say we walk and we try to keep our distance from others when we walk, and this can be interpreted in the field theory, or with regards to the field theory in physics. So we can have simple rules that are quite physical, and we can explain collective movements from the movement of big or big masses of people, and also situations where panic can lead to disaster. For instance, in a football stadium, there is some kind of disaster and everyone runs away. And there are two exits, and if, for instance, if I see that a lot of people are going to the same exit, I will also go to that same exit, and that causes a problem. So according to this theory, we could redesign football stadiums to avoid these kind of situations. Okay. So this is the introduction, and I leave you this sentence by Darwin. Darwin also had something interesting to say, and he also thought about ants, and so he said the following: the brain of an ant is one of the most marvelous things in the world. And this is a bit mysterious. He says, maybe even more than the human brain. Maybe this is a bit of an exaggeration, but there's no doubt that ants can teach us a lot of things. And so for us, the big question is whether, well, evolution created some solid networks, and at the same time it invented liquid intelligence. Are there other solutions? How can we compare both systems? Can we have a theory? And what can we learn to help us solve problems? First, we'll have Audrey. She's the director of a lab in the University of Toulouse, and she's published a lot of works, very interesting works on the topic she will discuss today. And so I would like to thank her, especially because she's going to Boston tomorrow. So this is a bit of an effort to be here for her.
I speak English or French if you like, but my Spanish is not good. So today I'm going to talk about problem solving in a very particular organism that are called slime molds. My training is in studying ants behavior. I've been studying ants behavior for more than 15 years now. I study traffic jam in ants, and especially why they don't get stuck in traffic jam, and we do. But today I want to talk about, so we can talk about that during the debate, but today I want to talk about the most fascinating organism that I've known so far, so which are the slime molds. So I don't know if you've ever met a slime mold in your life. They became famous in the 70s. By a particular story that happened in the United States in Texas. A woman called Mary found in her garden a slime mold, a very tiny one. She didn't know what it was, so she thought it was ugly and looked like scrambled eggs. So she took a rake and smashed it. So it fell in little pieces, but the day after, the thing was still there and it doubled size. So she tried to poison it, but she didn't succeed. The thing kept growing. So after she called the firemen and they sprayed water on top of it. The thing kept growing and growing. And after, because we are in Texas, she called the police. And the police started to shoot at the slime molds. And nothing happened. The thing started to grow, she started to be depressed and everything. And suddenly it disappeared. So the Washington Post concludes the only reason was that she was visited by an alien. It was in the 70s. So in fact, slime molds are no aliens. So I don't know if you know, like this is the tree of eukaryotes. So here we are, the animals. And so if you look here, you go back on time and you meet our first cousins, the fungi. And if you go still back on time, you find a group called Amebozoa. It's where the slime molds are. So the first slime molds are 1 billion years old. So it's quite an old organism, very primitive. And they are single-cell organisms. So if you've never met a slime mold, here they are. They are usually found in forest, on bark, in humid environment, and in the dark because they hate the light. So they can have this spongy shape. They can take all kinds of color depending on the species. More than 1,000 species of slime mold known so far. So they can be quite big. And so in the lab, we study one particular species. The most famous slime mold is Physarum polycephalum. So we call it slime molds. So this is a single-cell organism, and actually is the biggest single-cell organism in the world, and even make an entry in the Guinness Book of Records as the biggest cell ever, 10 meters square. But in fact, because the guy was so lazy to go up 10 meters square, because you need to feed your slime molds. But it can be bigger than 10 meters square. So you have to notice this is a single cell, okay? So this single cell is interesting when you study behavior because it crawls around, it's moving. So don't be scared. It moves 4 centimeters per hour, so we accelerate this video, so it would never crawl after you in the forest. So how does a cell like that move? So it moves because it has a network of veins. So this is inside the cell that you can see the network of veins. So it looks like our vein network, but it's very different because it's far more plastic than ours. And if you look at closely to this vein, the liquid circulating inside is the cytoplasm, so the liquid inside a cell, where you're going to find all the organoids, all the nuclei, because these cells have more than one nucleus. There are billions of nuclei. You will see the mitochondria and everything that you find usually in a cell. Usually in a cell, nothing is moving. Here, it's moving fast, and here, it's not accelerated. So if we looked a bit closer under the microscope, you would see that these veins are animated by contraction. And in fact, it's because they have like fibers, like muscle fibers, like our muscles. And if you look at the circulation, you would see that it goes in one direction, like that. And suddenly, it would stop, and whoop, it would go in the other direction. So this is particularly weird. And why the slime mold is doing that? So is it contracting his vein, pushing the liquid, and by doing that, he's building these little pseudopods, he's pushing his membrane. And you will see that he can make lots of extension like that. It's how he moves. So in fact, the slime mold is moving like the tide. He's go 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. If you look from outside now, you will see this contraction and pushing of the membrane. So it's how it moves. And you can even see the contraction of the vein because the veins are 1 millimeter width. So you can really see that with your naked eyes. So if you look at the slime mold as a whole, you would see that it's animated by this contraction, this oscillation. So you won't see that if you go in the forest. You have to be staying for a while to see this kind of contraction. But what you are seeing is not a breathing system. It's really like just liquid moving around. And if you look at it closely, you would see that it moves, but also is growing at the same time. So there's movement and growth. So the slime mold in the field is feeding on bacteria and fungi, so we are safe. And so this is a 24 hours videos. So you see like 2 fungus being attacked by slime molds, and you would see that slime molds are already contracting the fungi, and so you can see the liquid coming out. And after, you would have nothing left from these 2 fungus. It's quite scary. So the problem with slime mold is that they double size every day. You have to feed them all the time. And if you go on a weekend, this is what happens. Your slime mold would always find a way to escape and crawl on top of the wall. So it's some organisms that, so you have these cells that double, even triple size sometimes, and it grows and never stopped. So something very particular with this cell is quite amazing, and we're going to come about the idea of collective. It's like the math in slime molds are different. So if you take one slime mold, you can cut it into pieces, and it doesn't hurt. And you make lots of little small slime molds like that. So they're all clones of each other. So it's like 1 = 1 + 1. But the opposite is also true. If you take 2 pieces of slime molds, and they are genetically identical, you will see them growing in front of each other, and suddenly they would fuse with each other. All their vein network will connect, and they will make one single cell. So it's like 1 + 1 = 1 in slime molds. So why are they interesting? It's not just because they have all this particularity, it's that because these slime molds are showing us that even a primitive organism can solve kind of complex problem. So I'm going to go through some example of type of problems that the slime mold can solve. The first one is a maze experiment, and it was done by Toshi Nakagaki in 2000. So here how it works. So Toshi is marking with 2 letters the entrance and the exit of the maze, and after he's going to draw the shortest path of the maze in his maze, and after he will go to get his slime molds, who are always kept in the dark. The light can kill them. And so you see that they are very giant cells. So he's going to cut it into pieces and put them in the maze. So it's very meticulous. And after you will see the little pieces growing and touching and fusing with each other. And after, so you have one single slime mold in the maze. And after, what Toshi is going to do is going to put food at the entrance, oat flakes, the favorite food of slime molds in the lab, and at the exit. And you will see that the slime mold is sensing the food, and suddenly something is going on, lots of tide going on. And you will see that the slime mold is going to retract all the parts that are occupying dead end in the maze. So here you see it's completely disappearing, all the vein here. And you will just keep one single vein that would link the entrance and the exits and take the shortest path. So Toshi got an Ig Nobel Prize for this experiment. People thought it was very fun. So, but he did it again. He's the only, I think, scientist who got the Ig Nobel Prize twice. The second time, he shows that slime mold can build optimized network, even better than humans, actually. So here you have the slime mold. It's on Tokyo, and all these little white dots are the city around Tokyo. So they're oat flakes in reality. So you will see the slime mold is going to connect all the oat flakes together, and he's going to build a network out of all these oat flakes. And of course, when he finds nothing, he retracts everything, and he leaves empty space. And after a while, if you let the experiment go for 24 hours, you will have a network. And what Toshi did was to compare this network with the railway network of Tokyo. And so he showed that this network was more efficient and more robust than the railway network of Tokyo. So a lot of scientists did it again, and even with Spain it was done, and showed that slime molds were always smarter. So the second thing we have been studying in the lab is decision-making in slime molds. As you can see in this experiment, you have two food sources, and they're very, very similar. One is slightly more concentrated than the other one, and you can see that the slime mold is not making a mistake, and he goes straight away to the good food source because he can sense it with receptors, and he follows the gradient via chemotaxis. And we even challenge it with different, more complex decision, and you can see here, for example, you have 8 different food sources. Each of them have the same amount of calories. The only difference is the protein to carbohydrate ratio. And just one can maximize the growth of the slime mold, and it would straight away go to this food source. The second experiment we did was about navigation in slime mold. So here it's a simple experiment. You put the slime mold in the middle of an arena, there's nothing, there's no food, and you just let it explore. And what you will notice when a slime mold is exploring a completely homogeneous environment is at one point, he has to break into different fan-shaped pseudopods to explore its environment. And if he doesn't find anything, it retracts, and he leaves behind this trail, like an ant trail, but here it's mucus. And you can see that this mucus is quite repulsive for the slime mold, and it helps him navigate in its environment. So to prove this theory of an external memory in slime mold, we built this challenge that is very common in robotics. It's called the U-shaped challenge. So here you have a slime mold, here you have a food source, and the slime mold can sense the food source from a distance because it's really attractive, it's a lot of glucose. But here, in front of him, there's a trap, a U-shaped trap, and the slime mold cannot see this trap. It's just a piece of plastic, but he cannot crawl on top of it. So what, for robots, for example, what usually happens, it's like the robot goes there and gets stuck here because he's attracted to this food. So what the slime mold is doing is exactly the same. He, of course, fell in the trap, but you can really see very quickly that he's able to really get out and find the food source. And we show with Chris that without using this external memory, this mucus, he cannot do this challenge. So the last experiment we've been doing in the lab is showing that even a single-cell organism, so without a brain, by definition, because it has a single cell, can learn. Learning was supposed to be for animals and sometimes plants, but single-cell organisms were not supposed to be able to learn. But in fact, we show that using a very simple protocol that you can teach slime mold via habituation. So we can teach slime mold to kind of like something they usually hate. So in this experiment, for example, here you have the control slime mold. It's going to cross a bridge where we didn't put anything on top of it. These slime molds here have to cross a bridge where we put a repellent. So repellent can be any kind of substance the slime mold doesn't like. We have plenty of choice. And after I cross the bridge, we ask him to do it again and again and again. And you will see what's happening. So the first day, so the controller is crossing the bridge happily. Look at him. He doesn't like it at all. He doesn't like the repellent, and he's really struggling. But if we ask him again the day after, and again and again and again, you can see that after 5 days, it doesn't bother him anymore, this repellent. So we show for the first time a learning in a unicellular organism. So, but we were interested to see, as a collective, if he can learn, can he transfer this memory? Because we know that slime molds, they can fuse with each other. So if we look at this experiment, we have 2 slime molds, a naive one and one who has been learning about this repellent. So before the transfer, this is what happened. The one that knows, of course, will cross the bridge very quickly, and the one that is naive hates it. After what we do, we allow them to fuse and to connect the network. I don't know if you see the vein here, but the network are connected. As soon as the network are connected, we are cutting here and we test them again. And what you can see is that this time the naive one is crossing the bridge very fast. So this one didn't need to learn and go through the training to learn. It just needed to fuse with another one. So the slime mold were able to transfer their memory to another slime mold. So when we saw these results, we were wondering, so because we did also a fusion just for 1 hour, not allowing the network to connect, and it didn't work. So we knew that something had to be exchanged through the vein network. So we were thinking that perhaps there's like a circulating memory inside the slime mold that is going through this vein network. And so we were thinking, what could be the substrate of this memory? And the simplest thing would be the repellent itself. So it's what we tested after. So we took a slime mold and we do an injection, a topic injection of water, and we put a bridge with a repellent. And here we do a topic injection of the repellent itself. So these slime mold have never been learning anything. They're both naive. The only thing we do is an injection. And this is what happens. The one who had water is really struggling. He hates it. But the one who got repellent crossed easily. So just putting the repellent inside the cell was sufficient to create a learning. It's what we call a memory inception. We make the slime mold believe that he has been learning something. So after we wonder, how long can he keep this information? So something I didn't tell you about slime mold, which is the most amazing thing, is that you can dry them. So when you're tired of them growing and you want to go on holiday, there's a solution. You can dry your slime molds, and they can live like that for years. You don't need to feed them. You can keep them in your pocket. And if you want to revive them, you just have to put a droplet of water on top of them. So this is what you're going to see. I just put a droplet of water, and you will see suddenly the oscillation coming back, and slime mold is going away. And so we show in a very recent paper that slime mold, if you train them before put them asleep, they can keep this memory for up to a year. So the slime mold can keep this memory inside. And so the funny thing about this behavior too is that the slime mold, when it wakes up, is younger than when you put it asleep. It gets younger. It's like it's doing a reset. It's not doing a complete reset because you remember his training, but he's doing kind of a reset. So I hope I convinced you that sometimes you don't need a brain to do something very complex, and even very primitive organisms can do very complex stuff. And they work as a distributed system. It's exactly like an ant colony, and we can talk about ant colony more during the debate if you want. So all these solving problems that has inspired a lot of research, especially in computer science for network, of course, but also for robotics and cancer research too. And recently, we've been using slime mold as a biorobot to screen substances in the environment, harmful substances, because they are very good to sense very tiny concentration in the environment. So I thank you for your attention. I hope I convince you that slime molds are great.
Okay, amazing presentation, thank you very much. When you see how these systems work, you really wonder whether human beings are the most intelligent organisms on the earth, and maybe we should think again about the notion of intelligence. Can we have the video, please?
Hola. Ah, gràcies. Molt bé. Doncs jo el que us proposo ara...
Thank you. So now we're going to try and compare the biological metaphors to try and understand our society, urban systems and social systems. Very recently we started to explore this type of comparison. So I'm going to present some ideas to you, and I hope that there are more questions so that we can explore and keep exploring this new field. The story started around 1986-87, and at that time there were some Spectrum, Commodore 64, MSX, some different computers. I don't know whether you've heard about them, probably the older people have, and Louis Wright was a video game designer, and he created a video game with an helicopter that had to destroy cities. A lot of copies were sold, but he was actually not very satisfied with the product because he was not interested in designing the game, but designing the cities where the action happened. And he kept thinking about it, and he thought about how he could create a video game to create and manage a city instead of destroy a city. And so he started thinking about how to control urban system, which is something that our politicians, economists, and our city councils try to do, not always successfully. Sometimes they do manage to do so, but the models that they use, either explicitly or implicitly, are very important. Will based his work on the theories by a researcher very well known among urban planners, who was Jay Forrester. And he has a book, Urban Dynamics, that proposes a theory about how social systems grew and got collapsed. He really didn't try to predict a real model. But unfortunately, this game model did have an impact on policies, as we'll see later on, not always in a positive way. I think that the problem theories by Forrester is the assumptions he made, because he assumes that there is a maximum capacity of a population that can manage a city, and once this limit is surpassed, then there is a collapse. So from that point on, the immigrants that arrive to the city are seen as a parasitical element instead of something positive, and it harms the city. Well, this model, it can be criticized, and one of the main ideas that it can be criticized to is because of the complexity of the system. Of course, we understand that some cities do have a limit. Yes, we may agree on this, but it's also true that there are some people that are smart enough to integrate the different changes by planning. So this is the question: how can we make urban systems to grow in a sustainable and orderly manner? And this is an open question. We have good examples in nature of systems that are scalable, systems that are not limited, apparently, that they could go beyond a specific scale. Some of these systems are swarms. For instance, they can have tens of thousands of individuals, and they can be a lot bigger, and they form these emergent structures. And the complexity theories say that we can scale these phenomena thanks to the interaction of simple rules. And so we want to extract this knowledge and try to apply it to our own systems. As a collective behavior, as Ricard has already said, one of the most interesting phenomena is how intelligence emerges. And here there are two examples of intelligent systems. Intelligence understood as the capacity to adapt to a changing environment. We have termite nests and we have the brain. They are very different systems, but we can say that the common attribute of both systems is the existence of an internal network. And in the case of the brain, it has different centers that compute information. And in the termite nests, there is a transport network. And we could also say that the communication or the transport of the materials by the ants is also conveying information through the system. Both systems have optimizing processes because they need to optimize the amount of energy they use. So they build these type of structures and they can have they can adapt. So the next question is, okay, up to what extent we can consider that our society is a system that is adapting collectively and is computing, and we have a communication network between the different individuals that create the society, and we can go beyond that metaphor and maybe we can find common attributes to both systems. And I'm going to present a little system that allowed us to make this comparison beyond the qualitative metaphor. The system that we used is this one. There is a collective, there is some internal fight for power. They are bees, and there is one that wants to be more dominant, the queen, which is the one that lays the eggs. Since they are all sisters and they share the genes, all of them take care of the eggs and the descendants, but they are an agglomerate and so a community, and some of them go and find food, other individuals create the nest and protect the eggs and the newborns. Another system that we have is that created by IT experts that are creating some software, and we tried to discover whether there were dominant relationship between or among the different team members and whether there was a similar structure. Of course, I'm not saying that an IT or expert or a programmer is an insect. It's just an abstraction. They are parts of a collective system transferring information by exchanging emails or differently. And the idea is that there is a common pattern. Here we see real data. On the right-hand side, we have a network of interactions in a wasp's nest. Each little round piece is a wasp, and with the arrows we see dominant relationship, who has fought with who and who won, and the color indicates the intensity. We can do the same with the teams of programmers. For instance, if you go to open source programmers, there is usually a page with all the communication, so you can know about the communications that happen, so we can create a network with the different dissemination of information. So here it is interesting to see that the distribution of the amount of information, that is the number of messages here and here, number of fights between the wasps, well, they follow the same statistical pattern, so that means that there is some kind of periodicity. So heterogeneity is an important factor in these systems, and heterogeneity follows the similar mathematical rules. Beyond this pattern, there's a fundamental difference. In open source communities, there is a two-level hierarchy, a core of programmers that have a stronger interaction among themselves as compared to the other programmers. And if you know a little bit about the systems, you know that these people have more visibility or are somehow leading the project, or not so much leading, but they are integrating information and managing conflicts, and somehow they try to find consensus between the different branches of the project. So they have an important role in the project. And here I can't give you more details, but we find the same type of organization in the networks of the brain. If we take into account all the different interactions between the neurons in the brain, we will see that there is a core that of neurons that are more connected. We don't really know why, but it's been proposed that this core is needed to be able to integrate all the information and to act in a coherent way so that we can carry out the different tasks correctly. So we suggested a theoretical mechanism, and we think that there is a balance between local information that a lot of elements in the system are creating and the collective information, the integration of information that will be somehow developed into a higher charge or a higher degree of processes in some elements of the system. So I've talked about direct interactions between different elements, but there's another aspect that needs to be mentioned, and we will explore it in the future. That is indirect relationships. In termites, the termite is the builder of the structure, but also the regulator, because they regulate the traffic inside the termite's nest. And more recently, I think that computer programs are similar to the termite's nest, because we have programmers that communicate thanks to the software that they are creating. So the community creates some software in a collective manner, but the software itself is or guides the actions of the community. And if you are interested in these topics and you want to know more about how social systems evolve, please do come to the Bienal Plus, which is a workshop on the 6th of March, and we will use Google tools to analyze the use of documents in the last centuries, and we will study some of the more interesting phenomena, such as the emergence of slums and how they contribute to collective activities. Why am I saying this? Why am I showing this? Well, and this is related to the beginning of my talk. Another limitation of the model by Forrest is that he did not take into account the interactions of all the different components. Our cities are diverse and they have different types of collectivities or groups or fabrics, and they are not always negative or harmful, because they can create wealth or richness, and all the interactions need to be considered if we want to understand how cities evolve and if we want to have more sustainable and better urban environments. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we're going to sit down and have a Q&A session or a debate. We're going to give you some more details, and if there are any questions, you will be able to ask them after this little debate. So different things have been mentioned, very interesting things, and I am going to comment on them. I think that we can share our opinions with you. One of the things that have been mentioned is up to what extent the concepts of collective intelligence that we learn about from Physarum or other elements can be applied to humans, for instance. Sergi has mentioned one thing which I think is very interesting, and it is the following. The open source software communities, there is not one authority that imposes a criteria for the whole community, so it's a distributed community, but in the end, they do have a structure that is distributed, but it has a core that represents a hierarchical component, a fluid or liquid or fluid, yeah, component, because it's not a closed community, because people come in and go out. So there are some restrictions, but the question would be the following. These restrictions are very important when it comes to making predictions as to how to manage collective intelligence among human beings. And I insist, the idea of city and society and the potential of the collective intelligence has some limits. So what limits are there? This is my question. Is there any comment? Okay. Well, to me, this is an open question. I think first we should ask ourselves whether in these systems there is some type of collective computation. Well, something that we know is that this may lead to unrational situations. The environment, for instance, can make us accept some claims that are everywhere without using our criteria. So they can put an end to our critical sense. So it can affect collective intelligence. For instance, panic, as it has been mentioned, no? It can be present in society.
It's very difficult for me to follow.
So let's talk in English, I guess.
Yeah, you don't mind?
No problem. So okay. My question in short is, it's very often said that we should exploit features of society that can allow collective intelligence. So, because for some reason that would be good. And instead what we see is kind of the dark part of the story, that we react to panic, we react to fear in ways that correspond to collective behavior in, if you want, simpler organisms. If you're thinking what Naomi Klein used, the shock doctrine, that under shock we don't react rationally. Mm-hmm. So this is the dark part of the story. I was wondering if there's a way of thinking of collective intelligence in human societies in a positive way, if it makes sense.
Yes, I think we know that if you put more humans in a room, they're going to solve bigger problems that they can do alone. So you can have this collective intelligence even with humans. But it's true that the catastrophic effect of collective intelligence in humans are not so common in animals, for example, like ants. For example, you won't see panic movement in ants or traffic jam because they are less animated by this selfish aim. Because ants, I don't know if you know, but when they forage together, for example, they have the same aim, they share the same aim, they want to collect food and bring it back to the nest. But in humans, if you are in the street, we have all of us, each one particular aim that is not perhaps the one that you are sharing, etc. So it's very difficult, I guess, to coordinate like that. So it's perhaps, I think, perhaps the selfishness of humans. Yes.
before we go into a debate, we're supposed to do that at the end, because if you don't have the microphone, the streaming is not going to work. But we'll be back to that, because I think it's an interesting point, how religion and other cultural things either make societies cooperate or make societies be kind of slave societies.
This is this is an interesting layer of the difference between, let's say, biological rules and cultural rules. I would say that this is important to some level. But for me, and perhaps I was not able to transmit this in my talk, is the existence of universal constraints in the organization of the system. So, well, it's subject to these collective effects, as you mentioned, but there is a control. I think that our society is not of people. Call it governments or call it, well, this rich club in the open source communities. The question is why this core exists. And I think it exists in order to make sense of the collective activity, in order to be able to make a coherent global response. All right? So in a way, this rich club can control somehow this the emergent behavior, can channel somehow the collective response. The question is how, but this is an open question. But I think it's also remarkable to see that even in the brain, we find this core. It's now clear, more or less, that a core exists in our brains. And apparently this core develops from a young age, and it becomes more dense with age. As you age, the rich club becomes denser and denser. That's suggesting that when you age, you need to confront more complex scenarios, and this rich club is relevant for that, for dealing with these heterogeneous environments, or with adaptation, etc. And I don't think this is related to the cultural level. I think this is a more fundamental constraint. Well, but you could argue that in the brain there is no neurons are not subject to. It's a more bottom-up phenomena, you know. It's not. They don't have, let's say, free will. They're simpler than the whole organism, or even in the social insects. We could argue if there is culture or not, an insect culture or not, but it's not the same level of complexity as us. So I don't think the question can be easily responded in terms of complexity or cultural complexity. I'm not saying it's not relevant, but I guess this is a much more fundamental thing. No? Obviously, the full explanation needs to take into account everything, and religions played a very important role in stabilizing societies, but I think it's a different phenomena. It's a different layer.
Well, another thing that I think is interesting, I would like to know your thoughts about that, is comparing liquid systems, to use the term, with standard brains. What do you think is the limitations? So the fact that we are simpler in a number of ways, despite we can solve a lot of different interesting problems, what could be the limits of liquid brains? Because we have conquered the biosphere in a way, but social insects in other systems, and probably to some extent bacteria, have cognition. And so what is missing in terms of the complexity that can be achieved?
For me, there's nothing missing in liquid brains, because I think they offer more flexibility and plasticity than hard brain. And we are thinking that we are dominating the biosphere, but I think ants have been dominating the biosphere for a long time and are still doing it, and bacteria is the same, and they would be the last, I think. And so I'm sure we don't deal with, we solve not the same problems, but I think what makes success of bacteria or slime molds or ants are this plasticity in the way they solve their problem. Like, even if your neurons can change connection, they're still there, they cannot move. Ants, if you remove one ant, nothing's going to happen. If you cut a bit of slime molds, nothing's going to happen. The knowledge and the solving problem is not going to be affected at all. And I don't think it's the same with our brain. Perhaps you have this complexity with higher because you have a stability, but at the same time, you lose flexibility. So I think it's a balance between what you want to be stable and what you want to be plastic.
Right. I think there's also a number of examples. We didn't have the time for presenting that, but just to give an idea to the people here that the puzzle that we find sometimes is other organisms like planaria. The flatworm is a very simple organism. Has 2 little eyes, so it looks more complicated than it is, but it's considered kind of the first brain kind of system. And one of the peculiar things among many others that you find in planaria is that you can cut the planaria in different ways. It regenerates the whole thing. And if you train them to solve a simple problem, like defining which is the side of a labyrinth or a maze that you can choose, and you cut the head of the planaria, where the brain is supposed to be, and the part of the tail regenerates the whole brain and keeps the memory. So you kind of remove the brain, and despite that, there's an intrinsic memory that somehow it's capable of keep solving the problem. And that's kind of the very limited cases where we need to deal and what's going on there.
Yeah, but in planaria, in the paper, to be precise, they cut the brain, but they still left 5% of the brain cells.
Because the ganglia.
Yeah, there's distribution. So perhaps the information was distributed, and there was still, I think perhaps it relies still on perhaps neuron cells, but it's really highly distributed. While we are distributed, but some parts, and we know that about agnosia, for example, where you have a small lesion and you don't know the name of the vegetables anymore. And so we know that some parts of the brain are hardwired, and if you touch them, and for sure with very simple organisms, I think there's this plasticity that we perhaps lost a bit.
The question, I think, is how do we copy that? How we implement this plasticity in our social systems? Can we do that somehow?
That's a good question.
Well, maybe the fact that the society's collapse tells you the story that once you reach a given level of complexity, then you miss the plasticity.
Yeah.
Whereas small societies might be more able to cope with that. That's a very generic way of putting that. But so what do you think about plants? Because I'm especially curious about that. I'm completely skeptic about plants having any interesting kind of cognition beyond what bacteria can do.
So yeah, to tell you, there was like a paper, like recent papers that have been showing that plants, they can learn, so they can habituate, like slime molds, for example. So I don't know if you know the mimosa plants. It's a plant that you touch and it closes its leaves like that. And so if you do it again and again and again, it stops doing it. But it's not habituation per se, because you have to show that it's specific to this touching and it would react to another stimulus. So they didn't do the experiment in total, so they didn't check all the criteria of habituation, so it could just be a fatigue response, that the plant is not reacting anyway because it doesn't have an injury to react. And after there was this paper about classical conditioning and the same, some control are missing. So for the moment in plants, I'm still waiting for more like straightforward experiment showing, because when you want to show learning in very simple organism, there's like neuroscientists have defined rules, and I think that's important because they like did that because for example habituation can really be just a small stress response or fatigue, and if you wanted to call it learning, it has to be specific. Your animal need to be able to recover. There are lots of criteria like that, and if you just like to resume your experiment, just check one criteria, you are not doing good science anymore. So it's why we struggle for our experiment, because we went down all the criteria and it was quite complicated with slime molds. So I don't know in plants yet.
Okay. You said you want to add something?
Well, I have been discussing this with my friend George Vassell, who is a plant expert. And plants are quite intriguing because they don't move, you know, or they don't tend to move a lot.
They grow.
Well, but they move in a different scale. It's not like animals. So for me, it's I think it's a kind of system that is distributed in space and interacting with other organisms, and it's part of this, let's say, ecosystem. Not sure if they are also trying to compute anything as well. I mean, it's not like an animal that tries to predict the environment to survive. Here is more that is kind of reacting to the stimulus and growing if it has a chance to grow.
Yeah,
but
actually, I think one thing that makes me suspicious about this pretended complexity of plant cognition is that if you think in animals, so we develop a complex nervous system for for two reasons. One is that we move in environments that can be unpredictable, and the other is that our brains are really good machines for predicting what's going to happen. But if you stay in a place and you have energy that makes you essentially independent of search, you don't need such a thing. But if you look at the seeds, and the fact the seeds have to spread, it's kind of the movement here, and integrate information, you do that. You do see computations there, and you do see some kind of adaptive behavior, the part that moves, which is not fascinating maybe as intelligence, but is the part that clearly reveals integrating information.
Yeah. The work on roots too. I think the most fascinating work for me in plants so far was the work of a guy called František Baluska, who's been working on the roots, because the roots are very mobile and they can change shape, they can change direction, more than the plant itself.
Yeah, plastic. You know.
Yeah, and it's where the meristem are, where the growing cells are. And so I've seen some experiment on videos of roots, and it's quite amazing how can they avoid things, even navigate kind of a maze.
Yeah.
And so I think roots are the most interesting in plants, more than what we are seeing in fact. But Darwin was saying that the roots are the brain of the plants.
Darwin again, yeah.
Well, there is also another different strategy used by plants. They spend a lot of resources on defense. When the plant genome was sequenced, they found a lot of genes related to defense, a lot of chemical toxins released, and a lot of these hard shells, no. And this, I think, is different from animals,
Mm-hmm.
So it's clearly a different. Plants use a different strategy to cope with the environment.
Yeah.
And I think they're slow
Yes.
paced too, because they show that there are the electric signal exchange between cells in plants, but it's really slow. So it means that it's like a slow paced dynamic. So I don't know if dynamics is very important in interaction. So if you are very slow paced, I don't know how it works. So we'll see in the future, I think, because we are going to see more work on plants, I think.
It's oftentimes I find when I talk about ants as a subject of study, it's very common that people ask you about, so are we like behaving like ants, or should we learn something from ants? I have my own answers, but I'd like to know.
I don't think we are acting like ants. No, ants, for example, my subject is traffic jam. And in Toulouse, we're studying the fundamental diagrams. So when you increase density on a road, at the beginning you can go fast, and there's lots, and so you increase the flow. And at one point you reach what we call the capacity of the road, where the density is very high, you still go fast, but suddenly it's kind of going down. Density increase, but you are slowing down, and the flow starts to decrease until it gets to zero. Pedestrian is the same. And we showed recently in ants that you go up exactly the same, but you stay up there for a very, very long time. In fact, we never managed to get the ants to go down. First, they can endure densities that we cannot endure, and not by crossing on top of each other, but by being very reactive, or again, this flexibility in the rules of interaction. And the second thing is that when a road is busy, super busy, but just don't go. Just wait.
Yeah, there seems to be a different feature of ants, are more predictable in a way, tend to be more, the rules are more strict in the case of ants. But before we continue, there is a question, I think, from the audience.
Okay, but we'll need the micro.
It's not necessary, I suppose.
I think it is. I think it is for the streaming. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Farrell. My question is, are classified different kinds of plasticity? Because I don't know if the primitive intelligence is too complex to the complexity of our intelligence, because in evolution, near to Pleistocene, there's like most primitives for adapting the conditions of change, for create new habits. The evolution was create for 2 million of years to create this kind of complexity of plasticity. But in few thousand of years, the complexity on kind of levels, hierarchy levels, was made too quickly. My question is the kind of complexities is studied now with this kind of hierarchies of plasticity. There are different kinds of plasticity between the levels of the layers of the intelligent response in animals or plants and so on. Thank you.
And you mean like in the last 200 years there were more complexity? I think it's true that in human society, and I'm not a specialist at all, but for sure, like I think the internet brought us like a lot of connection together, a lot of interactions. Of course, came up a big like. But for the coming back to the slime molds, if you look at the network of a slime mold, the network of vein especially, is quite interesting. Because when I say plasticity, is that the vein, the position of the vein, the number of veins, the connection are changing all the time. But when I say all the time, it's all the time. You can look at the vein network changing because it adapts to what he found and how he wants to spread the nutrient inside the cell. So I don't know if a network like that exists, in fact, in human society. I have no idea. I'm not a specialist of human society and networks, but...
Well, we now start to have a lot of information, especially with social media. So, for instance, we can analyze the interactions in Twitter or Facebook or wherever. There is also information on the flow of money. So, interesting. And this is something I never said, but there's some recent studies showing that there is a few corporations form a rich club and that they control most of the flow of money in the world. So again, we have another sort of rich club, and in this case it's a rich club really, because they are very rich, obviously. So it's a rich club of people that controls the flow of transactions, economic transactions in the world. Beyond the standard interpretation that they are rich and they become richer, perhaps we should ask if this has something to do with some constraint that makes inevitable that this rich club appears once a complexity threshold is passed, as you were suggesting. So perhaps we should ask of levels of complexity instead.
Complexity, levels of plasticity.
Exactly. So I think I don't think it's enough to say complexity, but we should somehow define what level of we're addressing.
But the first constriction in this kind of intelligence is intelligence without representation.
Yeah.
Because the first living beings, they have no representation, like bacteria, archaea, slime molds, and so. That, but this kind of intelligence, well, I remember the Rudy Brooks in 1991 said about this, how it's necessary million of years for create this kind of adaptive behavior.
Yes.
And it's not necessary for create the layers, hierarchical layers, that is a different kind of adaptive behavior.
Yeah, well, that is...
It's a different nature.
Well, this is the theory behind the Roomba, no?
Ah, yeah,
exactly,
of course.
because you have a system that is just basically reactive, but can display some sort of intelligence, just using the right set of rules. I wonder if we can do this with society as well. Maybe we can somehow implement those rules and get some behavior, global behavior out of it.
But there are interferences between this kind of plasticities for cultural plasticity and instinct, intelligent instinct systems of instinctive and is collapsed or between us, because the culture say go there, or but this thing is no, you stop it. Oh, you're building mapping these kind of constrictions or the chokes between cultural distinct intelligence. What's going on?
Well, I think we should keep the microphone available for everyone also. I think that the idea that plasticity is there, it emerges in most biological systems because it's a source of adaptation. But when you go to the societies, which is a different story, then you have division of labor, you have the cultural aspects. And that's again something that implies that if the society gets really complex, you really need usually a lot of energy to maintain everything in place.
Yeah, that's right.
And for doing that, you have to be an ecosystem engineer. You have to actively modify the environment into your own benefit, which makes us, I think, very different from anything else.
Yeah, I think that here what we're trying to say is that there is a trade-off between robustness and complexity. So you could have something like a slime mold that is, let's say, simple in terms of the individuals, but it's absolutely fantastic because it's so robust. It works every time. You can do these amazing things like put it to sleep and then drop a piece of water and then it recovers instantaneously like magic. So that's amazing. On the other hand, we have complex societies that, as Ricard said, require a lot of effort and energy to maintain and to develop. So you always have to pay something.
I don't think that Audrey thinks that Fisarum is simple.
No, I don't understand.
Well,
it
was put in quotes.
I wish it was
simple.
simple.
No, I don't think it's simple. I think it's actually
because there's a mystery about slime molds, like
exactly.
You don't have anything stable inside the cell, and you try to look for the master brain or something centralized, and you have to think distributed. But even that, it's quite difficult in just one giant organism like that.
I must say
how
that
it coordinates.
I'm not surprised that the police shoot at the thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Because how do you deal with that?
Actually, it's more like in terms of putting the slime mold against complicated things like, I don't know, like the space shuttle or something like that. So that involves many parts. Obviously, the slime mold involves so many parts. And then in our technology has never produced anything as complex as the slime mold. I mean, we are still, we tend to think of ourselves as very advanced, but we cannot do, technologically, we haven't reached this point yet. We're still far from it, so.
So now we open to questions.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have so many questions. I'm fascinated by this Fisarum person. And I will only ask one, which is, Do you know by chance the mechanism through which it's able to incorporate memories about the repellent? Does it work for arbitrary repellents, or does it need to be a kind of repellent that you can integrate with DNA or RNA or something like that? Any clue at all? I'm just mind blown by that.
So we used two bitter substances first, quinine and caffeine. So we ate them both, but to show specificity, we took two beta substances. And we could see that, for example, if you habituate the slime mold to quinine, it's not habituated to caffeine, so it makes a difference. And after we moved to salt recently. So all salt is very interesting because there's also osmotic problem. And we wanted to see if it was specific to. So it's an experiment we are running now. So it's really like pilot studies for the moment. We are looking at the dimension of the memory. So what we are doing is to try to teach the slime molds to incorporate lots of different salts and see if specifically can remember them all. So what we've seen that is, for example, a slime mold habituated to sodium is not habituated to potassium, for example. But if you habituated them to sodium plus potassium, he's habituated to potassium and he's habituated to sodium and he's habituated to the combination. So we can teach him multiple salts, but he would make the difference between the different salts. So our idea was to, of course, that he incorporate for sure. He's drinking whatever he takes. He's always eating, and after he's excreting what he doesn't like. So we know that by just injecting the sodium inside the cell, we were able to do a training, but it was not a full process training. And even when we put him sleep and he recovered, the sodium was still there, but the concentration was very low. So I think there's something else. It's working a bit like that, but we are missing some parts. So we are trying to figure it out now. But some people are saying it's perhaps epigenetics because it's a question of everything now, epigenetics. So some are saying, oh, it's genetics like a protein synthesis because memory works like that in your brain. But I think we have to get out of the brain because it's a slime mold. He was there far before, and perhaps he used different mechanism. And so for the moment, we are a bit stuck, and so it's why we are trying with dimensionality, because it helps us anyway, because if it was just osmotic, for example, it would react the same to sodium and potassium. So we are like going step by step using behavior to try to understand the mechanism.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talks. Do you have any ideas on how you could transfer this idea of liquid intelligence into collections of robots, so to say? And what's like the minimum capability for an individual robot, like the minimum ingredient necessary for an individual robot to show for a group of them to show sort of an emergent behavior? I understand it's complex to do it in human societies, but maybe we can do it in robots where we can control individuals better.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been really a dialogue in two directions between the people working on collective intelligence and the biological part, and what's called swarm robotics, which is a whole field where both taking inspiration in nature and then looking for other directions. It's been possible to see that swarms of robots can solve collectively problems in a way that sometimes imitates nature, not all the time. But the thing that you bring is an open problem. So what's the minimum complexity that you need in the mind of each robot in order to get into collective behavior that solves complex problems that the individual cannot solve? And that's an open question that we've actually been exploring for years. There's this idea in biology that is still largely unexplored, that as you gain complexity, you get into more diversity. For example, cell types or number of ants in a colony. You lose individual complexity in a way or another, either in the phenotype or in the behavior, suggesting that it might be a trade-off. That really complex in the world of the liquid world, you get into collective complexity, collective intelligence that is remarkable. At, in a way, the cost of reducing the complexity of individuals. That's why a society like the one suggested in Star Trek is not going to happen. Why do you need, if everything has to be decided collectively, why you need really big brains? It's easier if you have smaller things. But still, it's, as far as I can see, it's open question. One of the most fascinating questions, actually.
Yeah. But it's true, like in ants, if you have a colony of leaf-cutting ants, for example, with 2 million of individuals, there's a strong division of labor. Each ant is almost specialized on one task, cutting leaves, taking care of the garden, but they have lost the flexibility. For example, a gardener cannot cut leaves, and the ants who cut leaves cannot take care of the garden. But if you look at the most primitive colony, where there's just 30 ants, for example, they're all very flexible. They can do everything, but they don't do it well. So it's always a question of that. If you're stuck on one task and you specialize on that, you are good, but you're not flexible. So a big society can work with a very specialized individual, but a small colony cannot, because if she lost one, everything falls down. So it's always a balance. And so I think in our society, we are very biggest societies.
If I can tell my little experience in the rainforest, well, actually the story is quite funny, because for a long time we worked in computational models of a rainforest, which were essentially black and white squares in a screen. And eventually, that was about the dynamics of rainforest. And eventually we were invited to the real thing, which were not black and white squares, was real trees and everything. And there we actually found out this is a naturalistic experience. The army ants, which were spectacular, 1 million or I don't know how many million of essentially blind ants, which follow chemical signals. But then we found out in one place in the forest there was the nest. The nest is not a solid nest. They form a nest with the bodies. So that's kind of a big ball of ants. So we did something that we shouldn't have done, but anyway. With a little stick, we make a hole. And then the eggs and larvae started to fall down. And out of the blue, the ants started to create a chain going into the floor and keeping back everything inside. And on the other hand, we also found out this little colony which is really small colony, the huge ants size like that. It's called, they say the 24 hours, because if they bite you, you feel pain for 24 hours. It was really interesting, because clearly the individuals were more or less on its own, with these big eyes that I think that can find out where we were. And you see, the trade-off, just a simple example, but the trade-off seems to be there. If you're in a small colony, you have to be able to make decisions and not just follow the collective.
Yeah, because army ants can get stuck and start to run in circles.
Oh, yeah. That's the other
they're
thing.
blind.
Exactly, that's the other thing.
Sometimes they just lay a trail in circle, not sitting up, and they can just turn like that until death.
Yeah. Here the intelligence thing is kind of,
Exactly. Sometimes it's not working well.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the individuals, because in complex systems, everything is about the interactions. So my suggestion is that you should try to architect the network of all those engines and how they communicate, what the protocols, how they do arrange in the network. I mean, from a computational point of view, you don't need a lot of complexity to create something that can compute in general, a Turing machine. The problem is that with the technology we have now, robots are quite limited in the repertoire of things that can do, and also very brittle. If you just kick at one of these bugs, it's going to explode, like happened to me 2 weeks ago, when inadvertently I just kicked my Roomba, and it went a flow across the room, and it crashed, and basically I need I had to buy another one. I mean, if you have an ant or something, it can be, it's quite robust. You can smash it, and sometimes they survive.
You don't have to, but
We don't use that.
So, in a way, it's provided you have some robots that is flexible enough or robust enough, then the next step is to architect the network of the interactions between all these guys. Okay.
So, some other question?
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering if somehow you have found so far any similarities between the capacity of these unicellular organisms with, for instance, cancer cells and their capacity to invade tissues, their architecture, or anything that you can tell that they share?
In fact, the people who are working on this problem are more focused on the morphogenesis of the networks of the physarum, because it follows from They are physicists, and they think that it follows exactly the same rule as when a tumor is growing, and at one point the tumor needs blood, and she's kind of manipulating our vein network to feed the cells themselves. And the morphogenesis, how she does that, the vascularization of the tumor, look exactly how slime mold are building the first vein. Because I show you big plasmodia, but at the beginning they're very tiny. They're less than 1 millimeter, and they have just 3 veins that are changing, but they're just 3 veins. And after it grows and grows. And they're just comparing how the morphogenesis, the law between this morphogenesis and the tumor. And they found it very similar. So for the moment is that. But there's other scientists looking at growth, because slime molds, as you can see, they cannot die, really. If you take care of them, they cannot die. We have our slime molds for more than 70 years, because they can just dry and you wake them up and they're young again, so you dry them, they wake up, etc. And you can do that as many times. And so the focus for the physium is how it can keep like not getting older like any kind of organisms. Why it doesn't age, and sometimes it's like exactly as the tumors that it grows all the time. And so some people are interested in that, and to be honest, there's no answer yet. We have no idea how the slime molds cannot die. So people are thinking that, you know, when, so the slime mold is at the beginning is a unicellular organism with 1 nucleus. And after every 8 hours, the nucleus divides, but we don't have the separation in multiple cells. So you have a cell with 2 nuclei and 4 and 8, etc., etc. And so these mitosis, they really look like a tumor. And they are thinking that perhaps when we drive them, we kind of make a reset. And you know, like when there's a division of 2 nuclei, the chromosomes are getting shorter because we cut the extremity, which is called telomere. And they think that perhaps the drying process, there's something, an enzyme like telomerase, which is very efficient, more efficient than in ours, that recreate the extremity of the chromosomes. And it's why it can keep living for longer. But it's just hypothesis so far. But people are really keen to compare them because it's this anarchic growth like that. So.
But I can also imagine that these cells, since they have more nuclei, they will also accumulate more mutations, right?
So far, no, we have no evidence of that. They are quite pretty similar, the nuclei. We didn't see any mutation. That's the question is how, because we have been keeping the same slime mold for 70 years, and in their behavior, they're quite constant. We didn't see, so we have some mutants that appear in the lab, but it's always linked to reproduction, sporulation, nothing into the behavior so far. But
nevertheless, I think it's interesting that you brought the question to the list in comparing with societies that have division of labor, because the only way you can defeat a society like our organism, which is strongly compartmentalized into organs and tissues, is to actually go into the embryonic states. So you lose information about what the others are saying. You lose the capacity of detecting inhibition signals in such a way you can adapt very easily, very quickly, unfortunately for us. And then it's evolutionary dynamics, what brings heterogeneity, what brings the potential for cancer. That if you look at from the outside, beyond the fact that it's a disease, looks like a system that is able to really find out solutions to, you know, every time you have a selection barrier, there's a way of breaking that. So it's again another kind of collective intelligence, right? Because you can actually have all sorts of phenomena, including learning. So, but of course, it's kind of going back into complexity in a way. Any other question? You can bring whatever you want now. Here? No.
Well, this slime mold seems super smart and like outsmart us in any way of resource effectiveness, of finding the smartest way to do everything. And you mentioned a few examples on how we can use them to kind of outmap logistic and infrastructure. So in our future, do you think we will use them in more kind of ways to kind of become a smarter society and a more sustainable society? What more do you think we will learn?
I don't know the future of slime molds, but what I can say is that in our lab we are thinking about the slime molds as a sensor, and because we are quite amazed by the way it's able to sense substances in the environment and also to store them. For example, there's a very similar species to Physarum polycephalum who is able to store zinc and manganese 1,000 times what is usually tolerable for a cell. Usually a cell shouldn't survive with that, but is able to store it in vacuoles. And so we are wondering if combining the fact that we can teach him to like some stuff and combining the fact that he can sense, the idea that we have is that can we select some slime molds who are better than others to select some kind of, for example, they are predator of bacteria. So it's quite interesting to see how they sense them, how they kill them, and how can we direct that. And so in the moment we are already also interested of what is secreting, because it's killing fungi and bacteria, and it's one of the most powerful pathogens for humans. And so we know that they must secrete antibiotics, fungicide. So in the moment we are more looking at slime mold as perhaps an opportunity to find new substance, but also find a way to sense substances in the environment. So it's more in this way we are going. But yeah, for the network, I'm not a specialist at all, but I know that lots of people, computer scientists, physicists, want to use, find the law of network, how the morphogenesis, how these networks are done and how they're moving to help for computer science and stuff like that, but I have no idea how it can work, to be honest. Can you get inspiration from slime molds network in computer science?
Well, in swarm intelligence, so people are trying to make inspiration on that. And for instance, using these systems as a reference for telecommunications or for solving graph problems, like finding shortest paths or whatever. So there's clearly there's room for applying these ideas in computer science and in other engineerings. I wonder if we can also learn how to control these things. We use these systems as a test bed in order to learn the principles of design, of biological design, and use this to re-engineer these systems to force them to make things for us.
They are quite difficult to control.
Yeah, but the first step to control something is to understand it, no? So I think we should invest more, do more research on these systems, really learn. There's a lot of things to discover here. Really learn how these systems work. Doing the sort that Audrey is doing all the time. So trying to reverse engineer all these systems. And I think there is a lot of things to learn from that.
Well, unfortunately, time's up. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Audrey and Sergi for coming here. I hope that this brought interesting ideas to think about, and it's a lot of things that we have been talking about, but I guess that this is enough exciting to keep looking for more information. Thanks to everyone for coming.
Thank you.